Isaac Hart presents Ghost in the Museum. Welcome back. I'm Isaac and this is episode 3 of the Ghost in the Museum podcast. Just wanted to start by saying thank you again to everyone who listened to and downloaded last month's story, London's Burning. I had such a brilliant response to it. Loads of people said that they loved the story, that they liked my voice. I had one review I was very pleased with that said that they had to pause it when old Jack talked about the view from his window. So I've always wanted to scare someone with my writing, and I think that genuinely might be the first time that it's happened, so I got a small thrill from that. Just a few quick updates before we get started with the story for this month. As some of you might have seen on the Instagram page, which is at ghostmuseum_podcast, if you want to keep up to date with everything, we have a schedule for the podcast now. From now on, I'll be releasing a new story on the last Monday of each month. So London's Burning got delayed because it was very, very long, and so it ended up releasing on a Saturday, which I don't think much suited the target audience, as I imagine most of you are listening to this on your commute into work or on your lunch break or while you're making tea, so that wasn't ideal. So with the Monday releases, I'm hoping there will be more time for the podcast to be listened to during the week before it gets swallowed up by Spotify or whatever other podcast app you're listening on. So this episode should be going out on 30th of October, Halloween Eve, if such a thing exists. Then episode 4 is out 27th of November, and episode 5, well, the last Monday in December is Christmas Day, and there's all sorts of folklore and superstition about ghosts and Christmas, so I'm avoiding that. And in the grand tradition of the BBC, I'm going to be releasing episode 5 on 24th December, Christmas Eve. You can consider that my first proper ghost story for Christmas, M.R. James style, which I'm very much looking forward to. So that's how things are going to be going forward, last Monday of the month, every month for the foreseeable. So on to this month's story. Now, this month's story, it's a newer one. I only came up with the idea for this one earlier this year during a bit of a creative and general funk I was in, if I'm being honest, so it's a bit different to the last two, which were old undergraduate stories I'd left to rot for a while. I'm going to be honest, this one's a dark one. I need to preface this episode with a trigger warning, if you want to call it that. This story deals with mature themes, and there's mentions of depression and child death. If you're sensitive to either of those things, I'd recommend to give this one a skip or listen with someone else. The last thing I want to do is actually give someone nightmares or distress them in any way. If not, and you're still with us, I'll get started. This is Beloved Son Asleep. They hadn't visited Kit since the funeral. Miles thought to himself as he and Zoe trudged slowly through the gates that led to the churchyard of St. Thomas the Martyr. It had been 2 months since then, or so he had been told. Time had taken on something of a liquid quality since their son had died, the weeks and days sliding over them like a river flowing over a stone. He and Zoe had been so lost in their grief that the thought of returning, of coming back to the quiet graveyard just down the street from the train station in Oxford, had seemed appalling, a heresy. It would have made it too real, the final, irrefutable full stop at the end of the sentence. Miles and Zoe walked slowly through the tall grass. The churchyard was overgrown, the graves lopsided, the whole place having the unmistakable quality of an English church long since abandoned by its parishioners. Gripping onto his wife, Miles's eyes duly flicked up and over to his left to take in the edifice of the church, its white stones glowing in the orange light of sunset. A small white square, the initials RB 1621 emblazoned within, blinked back at him. Robert Burton. The name bubbled up from some dark crevice of his mind, a memory of a half-forgotten undergraduate paper coming up for air in a brain drowning in rushing torrents. R.B. Robert Burton, Miles thought, barely cognizant. Burton had paid for the south porch of this church when he was curate of it, after he had abandoned his feeble attempts to escape the sequestered academic life that would in time entomb him in Oxford for eternity. Why do I know that? thought Miles. He felt Zoe stagger slightly next to him and pulled her closer. Why does anyone need to know that? What's the point? Miles and Zoe circled the south of the church, passing by the crumbling sandstone tombstones, their names disintegrating in illegible, grimacing skulls glowering out from the weeds. They made it to the spot and stood before Kit's grave, surrounded by the utter quietude of the churchyard. The noise of cars on the street before the church was muffled and distant. Not even the birds seemed to chirp. The sun was setting in earnest now, the molten orange glow filtering through the leaves of the tall yews that sprouted between the headstones, casting dappled globules of light about the grass like tiny volcanic craters. Miles faintly registered that Zoe was squeezing his hand tightly, and he returned the gesture, the two leaning on each other for support. Zoe was the first to speak, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "Hey, baby. We're here." Her voice quivered with emotion as she gazed at the headstone. The inscription glinted back, the etching fresh and unweathered. Christopher Francis Prescott, 2013, 2023. Our beloved son. So much left unsaid, Miles thought. The inscription meant nothing. Nothing that measured against everything Kit had been. Had been. Past tense. Miles stared out at the other headstones, the other inscriptions, the inscriptions that buckled with age and flaked off at the brush of a hand. How deeply had all of them been loved? How much had those now fragmentary inscriptions been mere fragments when they were new, mere shreds of the person they were now the sole record of? Zoe bit her lip, squeezing her eyes tightly. Her mouth opened and words failed to come, her jaw hanging open as she groped blindly for something to say. "It's Mummy, Kit. It's your Mummy and Daddy. We miss you. We miss you so, so much. It's been hard without you, baby." Miles squeezed her hand, and then stepped forward to limply place the sprig of yellow broom flowers on the grave. Kit's favourite, Miles thought. It was November. They shouldn't be blooming this late into the year. The noticeable difference in the climate since before Kit was born registered for the briefest of moments for Miles, before, like every thought he'd had in the last 2 months, it was squashed by the dreadful, all-encompassing fact that floored him from the minute he woke up in the morning to when he could finally drift off into restless, twisting sleep. Kit is dead. Your son is dead. He's dead. Miles swallowed hard, struggling to find the words. "I'm sorry," he finally whispered. "I'm so sorry we haven't been before now, Kit. It's just been..." The words trailed off, useless. Miles gritted his teeth. "But we wanted to come and see you, buddy. We wanted to come and see you and tell you how much we love you." He paused, choking back a sob. Zoe stepped closer to the grave, running a single slender finger along its top before pulling it back sharply as if scalded on an iron. Her tears were flowing freely now. "You were such a special boy, Kit. You made us so happy. We haven't forgotten you, baby. We love you." It was too much. Miles pulled Zoe close, and she buried her head in his chest. The howl of misery that came out of her was worse than a cry, and Miles felt the vibration shoot through his heart and reverberate around every corner of himself. The two of them stood there for an age, holding on to each other for dear life. It wasn't until the last of the orange glow had retreated and the churchyard began to sink into an inky blue that Zoe slowly lifted her head and turned her red, unfocused eyes to Miles. "I want to go home," she said, her voice blank. "I don't want to be here." Miles nodded, wordlessly, and the two of them staggered their way back in the direction they had come, grasping onto each other's midriffs. Miles passed the RB 1621, now on his left. The Anatomy of Melancholy. The title of Burton's book had finally been processed by his overcooked brain. A great, weighty tome on all the distinct kinds of misery a 17th century academic could categorise. He'd read it once, Miles remembered, an original pressing, when he was a student at Brasenose, Burton's alma mater. Miles thought of all the different kinds of depression that Burton had meticulously examined in his work. Fear, need, grief, discontent, anguish, vexation, lumpishness. Not a one of them encompassed the gnawing, gaping chasm that had opened up in his chest. They had nearly made it back to the car, when Miles spotted it. It was half buried in the heaps of dead leaves which lay about the long grass, its jagged edge just visible above the blades. The closer he and Zoe came, the more apparent it became to Miles that it was a headstone, or at least the remainder of a headstone. It looked as if it had cracked horizontally about 2/3 down its length, leaving just the base of the grave leaning listlessly in the foliage. As they passed through the gates, Miles caught the few fragmentary lines of inscription that remained on the rump of the grave. Full and sudden end in the 10th year of his age, on the 18th day of December 1723, to the misery of his mother and father, beloved son asleep. Miles paused for a moment by the grave, as Zoe wiped her face with the sleeve of her jacket and fumbled for the car keys. He looked back to where Kit's grave was, before it vanished into the rows of other headstones. It was really very small. The ringing of the doorbell made Miles jump with a start. He and Zoe had been curled up together on the couch, sitting quietly in the dark lounge, the light from the windows blocked out with heavy curtains. Zoe whimpered slightly at the incessant shrill of the bell, as whoever was outside rang it for a second time. Miles unfurled himself from his wife's embrace, tracing the inside of her arm as he stood up, a silent gesture that meant something close to, "I'll deal with it." He felt his way down the dark hallway, towards the light coming through the glass windows of the front door. He could see a figure waiting outside, rendered featureless by the blurring of glass. Miles opened the door, blinking in the unseasonably bright November light. Simon, his colleague from the Ashmolean Museum, was stood on the doorstep, his hand hovering over the doorbell as if he were intending to ring it for a third time. Miles winced slightly as he saw Simon's eyes widen in shock as he took in his appearance. He and Zoe hadn't seen Simon since the funeral, and Miles knew that they must look dreadful to him. He couldn't remember the last time he had shaved or had his hair cut. He instinctively pushed back a strand of lank, unwashed hair out of his face. "Miles," Simon finally said, trying to regain his composure. "How are you?" Miles could see that Simon regretted his formulation of that particular sentence the moment it had left his mouth. He knew Simon hadn't meant to cause offence, but it still took a significant effort from Miles not to snap back in an instant. "How am I? How do you think I am, Simon?" Instead, he merely bit his lip and sighed. "Sigh," Miles said, his voice hoarse from lack of use. "Thanks for coming." Miles turned and retreated into the dark of the house, Simon tentatively stepping in behind him and looking around. The house was quiet, a palpable sense of sadness heavy in the air. Without even looking back, Miles could tell that Simon was treading carefully, as if he was afraid that the whole building would shatter like spun sugar if he took a wrong step. The two men entered the lounge. Miles saw that Zoe was still on the couch but had pulled herself into a sitting position, her legs pulled against her chest and her arms wrapped tightly around them, her eyes blank, staring into empty space. She looked up when Simon came in the room but didn't say anything. Miles could see that she was barely holding on as much as he was. "I'm so sorry," Simon said softly, his voice breaking. I can't pretend to know what you're going through. I can't even imagine." Miles nodded, feeling tears starting to form in his eyes. He sniffled loudly, willing them to retreat back into his eyes. He wasn't willing to break down immediately in front of his boss, not after he had asked Simon to come there in the first place. "It's been hard," Miles finally choked out, his voice barely audible even to himself. We miss him? The house... We can't stand it without him." Simon nervously sat down next to Zoe. She leaned into him, and he tentatively put his arm around her as she sank back into quiet sobs. Simon didn't say anything, but he held her close and let her cry. Miles and Zoe had known Simon since their undergraduate days. They'd been at Brasenose, he at University College. Simon and Miles had reconnected in recent years when they had both come to work at the Ashmolean, Simon as curator for the Department of Antiquities, Miles under him as a researcher specialising in Roman and Byzantine artefacts. The three of them and Simon's wife Amanda had taken their children on playdates together. Amanda and Zoe had worked as teachers at the same school. Thinking back on those days now made Miles want to scream. He sank down into a chair opposite the couch, head down, running his hands through his hair. "How's Mandy?" Miles asked quietly, not able to meet Simon's eye. Simon bit his lip, unsure of what to say as Zoe continued to sniffle on his lap. "Not great," he said delicately. "She checks in on the kids a lot when they're asleep upstairs. I come with her. She just pokes her head into the room, just to check that." Simon trailed off, bowing his head in distress and what looked to Miles like embarrassment. He knew that Simon wouldn't want to equate his and Amanda's distress to his and Zoe's, but Miles understood the unspoken terror that was drawing Amanda up to her son and daughter's room hour upon hour, just to check that they're still breathing. That's what Simon was going to say before he stopped himself. Miles didn't blame Simon. He could imagine the fear that had sunk into Simon and Amanda's souls, that the same thing that had befallen him and Zoe might just as easily have happened to them instead, could just as easily still happen. Miles felt his own insides twist with guilt. The memory of him screaming down the phone at Simon after he and Zoe had found Kit must have burned deep into Simon's mind as it had his own. Zoe all at once gave a loud grunt and removed herself from Simon's lap, wiping her face with her sleeve as if trying to bring herself back into the room. "I'll, go and make some tea," she muttered, heaving herself limply from the sofa and staggering off in the direction of the kitchen before Simon could protest. Miles and Simon were alone together in the lounge. Simon cleared his throat, still looking uncomfortable and a little lost. The weight of the air felt like it was crushing both men, like divers at the bottom of an undersea trench, unable to surface for fear of the bends. After a while, Simon spoke. "So, Miles," he began, rubbing his hands together nervously. "You, wanted to talk to me about coming back to the museum?" "The museum?" Miles asked dully. Simon took a deep breath. "The Ashmolean, Miles. You sent me an email yesterday saying you wanted to come back to work." Miles looked confused for a moment, his face screwed up, before realisation washed over him. "Oh," he muttered. "Yeah, I did. Sorry, Si. Mind was somewhere else there for a moment." Miles could see that Simon was regarding him with increasing wariness. He put his next words to Miles very carefully. "Miles," Simon began delicately, "are you sure you're ready to come back to work? I mean, so soon?" Miles felt his insides twist again. "I don't know," he admitted, not able to meet Simon's eye. "I just know that I can't go on like this, Si. Me and Zoe, we're going stir in here. Neither of us can bear it. We feel like we're just existing or something. I need to do something, Si. Anything else? I need to get out of the house." There was a quiet between the two men for a while, the slow clattering of Zoe in the kitchen the only sound in the house. "I get that," Simon said finally. "And we're all missing you at the museum, Miles. We really are, but you don't think I'm ready to come back?" Miles interjected, finishing Simon's sentence for him with a downcast expression. Simon bowed his head. "No, I don't," he said gently. "I think you and Zoe need to talk about getting some more help before either of you think about coming back. You're both really struggling. Me and Mandy are worried about you both." Miles looked up, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "Help?" he asked, his voice quiet. Simon took another deep breath. I mean like a therapist or a grief counsellor or something," he suggested. "They might be able to help you both work through, well, everything." Miles shook his head, running his hands through his hair with greater, more ragged force. No, he muttered. "I don't need help. I just need to get back, to get out. That's all I need." Simon sighed. "And Zoe?" he asked, his voice sad and quiet. Miles felt tears welling up in his eyes again. "I don't know if I can put her through it," he admitted. I don't know if either of us could live without him." Simon looked at a loss for words. Zoe slowly came back into the room, holding 3 mugs in her hands and setting them down on the table without a word. She slumped back into the sofa, back into the indent she had left in the cushions. 3, Zoe said in a small, haunted voice. "We have 3 of everything." November was teetering on the edge of December. The unseasonable warm weather was refusing to shift, the air uncomfortably humid, the bare trees unswaying in the still air. Miles trudged out of the semi-on-Brogden close where he and Zoe lived, where he and Zoe and Kit had lived, and began to walk, not particularly caring where he ended up. He had his hands in his pockets, his shoes kicking up the limp, festering piles of brown leaves which lay heaped all about the trunks of the trees that lined the street. The air reeked of mouldering plant matter. It was a Saturday. Zoe was in town catching up with her friends from the school, Amanda and Rose and Verity, and a few others for whom Miles was unable at the moment to conjure the names for, only that they had all at one point or another been around the house on Brogden Close for tea, or to babysit Kit when he was small. They had also been at the house for the wake back in September, and had all expressed their sympathies to Miles and Zoe with an earnestness that made Miles feel numb as he recalled them. "We're here for you both," Amanda had said, "whatever you need." "He was such a sweet boy," Rose had whispered. "I remember he used to follow you around like a little duckling, Miles." "He loved you," Verity smiled weakly at them. "He was so lucky to have such loving parents." Their kind, cruel words stabbed Miles's brain like hot needles as he wandered aimlessly through the underpass beneath the motorway that ran past their house and across the fields of the primary school where his wife worked. He could picture the women now, in the cafe with Zoe, warm drinks in hand, cocooning her with soft words and gentle smiles. It was what Zoe deserved, and it was also what Miles knew he had singularly failed to provide for her. Zoe had shown him as much. The day Simon had visited, after he had drunk his tea and made his hurried, apologetic goodbyes. They had lain there, in the dark of the lounge, and Zoe had confided in him, bared her soul to him, for the first time since their son had died. "I don't know who I am anymore," she had said. Her voice had shaken. She had stared out into the darkness with wide, blank eyes. "I've been Kit's mum for so long. Now he's gone. I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm lost, Miles." Miles only realised now, too late, that this had been an invitation, a chance to bear himself to Zoe as she had to him. He even knew what he should have said. "You'll always be Kit's mother. No one can take that away from you. But you're more than just a mum. You're a strong, brave woman that's been through a lot. You're my wife. I love you, Zoe." But he hadn't said it. For the umpteenth time in their 2 months of torment, all Miles had been able to muster was a feeble squeeze of Zoe's hand. Worse than useless. Miles didn't blame Zoe for pulling away in that moment, for insisting that she wanted to sleep by herself that night. Miles knew that Simon was right in that unspoken accusation. What about Zoe? He was of no use to his wife, to his job, and was of no use to his son ever again. Before he knew it, Miles found himself outside St. Thomas the Martyr. He blinked for a moment. The church was a good half-hour's walk from his house, over the Thames and past the train station. He'd carried himself there unconsciously. Miles stared up at the weather-beaten trunk of the church tower, its clock face forever frozen at 20 minutes past 3. Miles remembered dully the first time he had seen St. Thomas's. It had been on a trip to Oxford Castle, in the first term of his undergraduate degree at Brasenose. The guide, in their faux medieval jerkin, had shown his group up to the top of the tower, at the commanding view of Oxford and its dreaming spires. Miles was something of an obsessive for old churches at that age, which is why he thought he had spotted it, the Tower of St. Thomas's, peeking out at the edge of town. It was one he had somehow missed when he was exploring the city in his first weeks in Oxford. He'd always meant to visit it properly, but soon after his trip around the castle he'd had to knuckle down on his degree in early modern history, on that essay on the anatomy of melancholy, and soon after he and Zoe had had their first date at the Swan and Castle just before Christmas. 25 years ago now, Miles thought to himself. Miles swallowed hard and took his first few tentative steps into the churchyard. There was the array of lopsided crumbling headstones, the RB inscription to his left, the blackened old gatehouse to his right in the far corner. Walk towards the gatehouse. Turn left. Your son is buried in the east corner. Miles was frozen at the entrance, trembling. He bit down hard on his clenched fist, breathing heavily, trying and failing to summon the will to cross the churchyard. He cursed his selfishness, his cowardice, his inability to be of use to anyone, even his own son, lying dead just around the corner from where he was stood now. Miles turned despairingly to his right. There was the cracked stump of the old headstone, the one he had spotted the last time he and Zoe were here. He stared at it for a while. His historian's mind picked over the details of the enigmatic remaining words on the stone. Full and sudden end. Mournful, rueful, sorrowful. Miles didn't know enough about 18th century headstones to know what the phrase might have been. Byzantine numismatics was his area of expertise. That felt pitifully irrelevant now. In the 10th year of his age. Miles kneeled down next to the headstone, brushing aside the tall grass that enveloped it. 10 years old. The same age Kit had been. Miles felt his hackles rise involuntarily. This tomb had been there when he had first locked eyes on St. Thomas's all those years ago, unknowing that it was here, waiting for him, that he would give this long-dead boy a neighbour. To the misery of his mother and father. Miles felt tears sting his eyes. Whoever this grave had belonged to had clearly wounded their parents in their death as much as Kit had in his. Memories flared up again, scorching through him like a flamethrower. He had been so proud of Kit. He had loved being a dad so much. It was so unfair. He and Zoe didn't deserve this. No one did. Beloved son, asleep. Miles blinked back the tear, reading and rereading the last line of the inscription. It wasn't a Bible passage, he knew that much, and it didn't come from any of the great English preachers that he knew. The phrasing of it tore at his mind like a rake. Asleep. Kit had been asleep when it had happened. The top of the headstone was nowhere to be seen, not toppled over in the long grass or else reused as a paving slab on the path that he and Zoe had walked down to reach Kit's grave, although plenty of other headstones were now trodden underfoot. Miles had always wondered how long the rector of the church had waited between the time someone was buried and the time he decided to flatten their headstone. 100 years? 50? 30? Well, surely the person having their monument filed away would still have had someone who had loved them, who still loved them, who might complain just 30 years later. How long would it take for Kit's to be flattened? Or would it be like the grave of this boy? This beloved son, cracked in two, his name missing, forgotten in the weeds. Miles could feel himself hyperventilating, his hands shaking, the churchyard spinning around him. He tried to stand, but his legs gave way, and he toppled forward, his hands grasping to steady himself and connecting with the jagged top of the tombstone. Miles swore as he felt the stone cut into the flesh of his hand, and he toppled back into the long grass. He curled up into a ball, his head buried in the earth, bloodied hands tearing at his hair. Miles didn't know how long he lay there, in front of the broken headstone. No one came to see who had shouted. After a while, he rose to his feet, like a punch-drunk boxer, swaying in the windless air. He looked down at his hands. He had a shallow gash in the palms of both of them, peppered with flecks of stone and grime. Miles swore to himself again, wiping his hands on his jacket. He'd need to go home and wash them, then bandage them up. If he felt useless now, then God knows how he'd feel if he was bedridden with an infection, Zoe having to look after him on top of everything else. He gave one last look at the broken headstone, the words throbbing before him, taunting them with their incompleteness. "Sorry, buddy," Miles muttered to his son. "I'll come back soon." Miles moved slowly out of the churchyard. Zoe would be back home soon. The least he could do was make sure there was something to eat waiting for her. The nightmare, or the memory as Miles knew it to be, was the same as it had been every night since Kit had died. He relived it, in its photographic exactness, haunted by the day that the world had ended, the morning that he had gone into Kit's room, to wake him up for school, to find him tangled in his bed sheets. He looked asleep. He was cold. He didn't respond. Miles woke up with a start, gasping for air, his bandaged hands tearing at his throat as he struggled to catch his breath. He could feel Zoe's arms around him, holding him tightly. "It's okay, Miles," she whispered. "It's just a nightmare. I'm here. I've got you." Miles clung on to her, shaking with sobs as he tried desperately to push the horrendous images from his mind, but he remembered it all. The confusion, the mounting dread, the screaming as they had tried to save their son's life. It had all happened so fast, and yet it felt like it had gone on forever, a waking, endless nightmare. Zoe held him close, her own tears mingling with his. "I'm here, baby," she said again. "I'm not going anywhere. We'll get through this. We get through this together." Miles buried his face in her chest, trying to calm himself down. He knew that Zoe was right. What was he thinking that he could bury this pain in his work? They had to face the grief head on if they were ever going to move forward, but the pain was so raw, so overwhelming. The future without Kit. It was impossible. Unimaginable. A future with 2 mugs instead of 3 for the rest of their lives. Miles felt the cuts on his hands sting with pain. The broken tombstone loomed over the fading remains of the nightmare, a jagged shadow enveloping everything. To the misery of his mother and father. "I'm sorry," Miles sobbed. "I'm so sorry." He and Zoe held each other under the covers, their bodies twisted together like a corpse in a winding sheet. The waiting room at the counselling centre was a small, impersonal space. Miles couldn't help but notice the slightly tatty furniture, the dog-eared copies of lifestyle magazines piled haphazardly amongst leaflets on therapy that gawped back at him with cartoonish, simplified figures that he assumed were meant to be reassuring, but to him seemed almost mocking in their platitudes. It's okay not to be okay. Miles hadn't been okay for almost 3 months, and he was about as far from okay with that as it was possible to be. He and Zoe sat side by side in the quiet waiting room, holding each other tightly, not exchanging any words. They'd been nervous about coming here, but Simon had convinced them that it was the right thing to do, and Amanda had managed to get them an appointment with a counsellor friend of hers. Miles was grateful that they had managed to avoid the months of delays that would have awaited them had they tried to book counselling by themselves. Miles had barely slept the night before, replaying the memories of Kit's life and death over and over in his mind. Zoe had been having nightmares too. She had confided in Miles as much, but Miles felt as if his grief was somehow deepening, the chasm growing wider and deeper until it was a great yawning pit, and that headstone, that damn crack headstone was beginning to pepper his memories like black mould spreading on a damp wall, sprouting across his memories like a poisoned mushroom. As they sat there, slumped and barely able to muster the energy to speak, a mousy woman with a warm smile and a gentle demeanour appeared in the doorway. "Hello," she said softly. "I'm Ashley. Are you Miles and Zoe?" Miles nodded while Zoe let out a small, almost inaudible yes. Ashley led them into her office and took a seat across from them, placing a notepad and pen on her desk, which was cluttered with picture frames and stacks of paper. "I know this is difficult," she said, "but I want you to know that I'm here to help you. And I understand you're both going through a very, very tough time right now." Miles looked up at her, his eyes as red and stinging as his hands were. "It's like we're living in a nightmare," he said hoarsely. Zoe nodded in agreement. Tears were already streaming down her face. "We don't know how to go on without him," she whispered. Ashley was listening carefully to their words, scribbling notes as they spoke. The session began quietly enough, filled with the usual affirmations and gentle prodding that Miles had been girding himself for. Ashley fixed them with a gaze that Miles considered gentle but firm. He gulped. He knew now that they were about to cross the unspoken threshold that had been rearing up to face them ever since he and Zoe had walked through the door, like the tidal wave in an encroaching tsunami. "Can you tell me about the night before Kit passed away?" Ashley asked softly. Miles and Zoe exchanged a brief, pained look before Miles cleared his throat and began to speak. It was just a normal night," he said, his voice heavy with grief. "We had dinner together, watched a movie, and then I tucked Kit into bed." Zoe spoke up, dabbing at her tears with the tissue she had scrunched up in her hands. He was so excited for school the next day," she said, her voice trembling. He wanted to wear his new backpack." Ashley nodded, making notes on her pad. "Miles, what were your last words to Kit?" she asked gently. Miles looked down at his hands. Beneath the bandages they were red, sore, throbbing. "No monsters here," he said, his voice breaking. Ashley paused for a moment. "No monsters here?" she asked delicately. Miles looked up at the ceiling, trying to control his breathing. "Kit, when he was little, he was scared that there were monsters under his bed," he said shakily. He'd gotten over it, but it was still this thing we did. He'd asked me to check under his bed. I'd make a big deal of kneeling down, looking left and right under his bed, and then I'd stand up and tell him that there were no monsters there, that he was safe." Miles trailed off, his face screwed up with the unbearable, crushing banality of it all. I told him he was safe," he cried. I can't, I had no idea it would be the last time I spoke to him." Zoe wrapped her arms around Miles, holding him close. Ashley sat with them in silence, as if comprehending the weight of the words, the insignificant moments of life that took on such immense weight in the face of tragedy. Ashley listened patiently as Miles and Zoe recounted the events of the day that they lost Kit. Both were in tears by now, the pain of the memories clear for her to see. We waited for the ambulance to arrive," Miles gulped. "I called Simon. I was just screaming. He didn't even understand what was going on. That whole day is just a blur." Zoe nodded, her face wet with tears. They wouldn't let us onto the ambulance," she said, her jaw clenching. "We had to drive behind it all the way to the hospital. It was agony. It was like we were both in a nightmare." Miles closed his eyes. It was too late," he said, his body shaking with sobs.
He was gone. When we got there, it was like being skinned alive. I've never felt pain like that before.
Zoe's head sunk onto Miles's shoulder.
They let us see him. He looked like he was asleep,
she said, her voice hollow.
It's so peaceful. I couldn't believe he was gone. I just couldn't. Doctors told us it was undiagnosed heart condition, sudden cardiac arrhythmia, they said, almost instantaneous.
Miles hissed through gritted teeth.
They said there was nothing we could have done to save him.
Zoe held the useless, damp tissue close to her face, unable to dab the tears away.
He was such a handsome boy, she sobbed. I loved his smile, his little freckles, the way he laughed. He had so much to live for. He was so clever. I loved him so much and he's dead.
Ashley regarded the two of them with a sympathetic gaze. Miles was rocking back and forth, eyes still squeezed shut. Miles, can you tell me how you're feeling right now? She asked gently. Miles stopped rocking for a moment and his red eyes shot open. He looked at Ashley, his face contorting with anger and pain. How do you think I'm feeling? He snapped bitterly. My son is dead! How am I supposed to feel? Ashley nodded, remaining calm despite the outburst. I understand how difficult this is for you, Miles, for the both of you, she said softly, but I want to help you work through it. It's okay to feel pain, to cry, to be angry, but it's also important to find ways to cope, to try and find a way forward. She leaned forward, fixing Miles with that probing, cautious stare. Miles, can you describe how you're feeling right now, in this room? She asked. Miles closed his eyes again and took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to control his emotions.
Angry? He said finally. We waited so long for a child. 5 years. On IVF, we almost gave up. And then we finally had one, and he was perfect. Perfect. Kitty. He completed our life, and then he was taken away for no reason. For no reason. It's like God played a trick on us. I'm so angry all the time.
Zoe leaned closer to Miles, placing her hand on his shoulder and squeezing it tightly. Ashley nodded again, listening carefully. That's a very understandable feeling, she said kindly. It's natural to feel anger and confusion in a situation like this, but remember, you don't have to go through this alone, Miles. You have Zoe and your friends. I'm here too. We're here to help you. Miles looked at Ashley, his red eyes burning from crying.
I just don't know how to go on, he whispered. The house, life, everything feels empty without Kit.
Ashley nodded sympathetically before turning to Zoe. And how are you feeling, Zoe? Zoe took a deep breath before answering, her voice trembling.
I feel like I've died,
she said blankly, tears streaming down her face.
Like just a ghost, haunting my own life. Every memory I have of Kit, it's like it's been poisoned. I keep grasping at them, trying to hold on, but they slip away from me.
Miles put an arm around her and pulled her close, his own tears falling silently down his face. He was clenching and unclenching his bandaged hands, blind fury still pumping through him. Zoe continued.
I remember the day Kit was born. I was so happy. I was so full of hope for the future, and now I can't even think about that day without feeling sick. It's like everything good in my life has been taken away.
The session continued in much the same vein for another hour. As it came to an end, Miles and Zoe slowly stood up, their faces ashen. Ashley held out her hand and they both took it, allowing her to guide them towards the door. I'm deeply concerned for your mental health, she said softly, her voice full of sympathy. Please come back for another session, okay? And in the meantime, take this medication. It will help you sleep. Miles nodded numbly, taking the prescription from her. Thank you, he mumbled, his voice hoarse. He had no intention of using the small packet of pills. Miles couldn't bear the thought of trying to obliterate his memories of Kit when they were all he seemed to have left of him. Zoe clutched Ashley's hand tightly. Her tears run dry. We'll be back, she whispered. Ashley squeezed their hands gently. Miles hated the look of pity and sympathy she gave him. Take care of yourselves, she said softly, watching as they walked out of the door. Simon and Amanda had invited Miles and Zoe around to their house for a few days. Miles had gone along with it, despite his reservations. It was the only thing that he could think of to try and pull them out of their funk, to get them away from the house where their son had died. It was all as awkward and artificial as Miles had feared. The days dragged on in a glum, muffled silence, like at a wake. Miles and Zoe would be sat across from Simon and Amanda at mealtimes, their eyes cast down, barely touching their food. Their host's two children, Martin and Sally, chatted away, blissfully unaware of the grief that hung over the room like a heavy cloud. Miles couldn't help but notice how Zoe seemed to flinch every time one of the kids made a loud noise or giggled too loudly. Hesitant suggestions to go on walks or to take a drive through the country for some fresh air were met with the briefest of flickers from Miles and Zoe's eyes, while Martin and Sally cheered at the prospect of the day out. Miles would catch himself in a half smile at their exuberance and then drop it just as quickly, as if he'd caught himself doing something he shouldn't. Zoe's eyes would sparkle for a moment before she looked away again. They would go through the motions, walking along the rutted country paths in Oxfordshire, Simon and Amanda and the children up ahead, Zoe and Miles hanging back, hands clenched together. Miles would watch the backs of the children's heads and feel the knot tightening in his chest, unable to shake the waves of jealousy and resentment that gnawed at him from the inside. His eyes clouded with fear at the horrid, resentful thoughts, and he'd pull himself closer to his wife, trying to anchor himself. You're not a bad person. You're just going through a really difficult time. He'd try and crush the feelings, to pack them away in some corner of his mind where he'd never have to confront them again. But as he watched Martin and Sally play, all he could think about was Kit, and how he'd never play with him again. After the quiet walk, they would return home, and pass a silent dinner by as the children chatted obliviously. Simon couldn't meet Miles's eye, and Miles suspected that some part of his friend realised what a horror it was for him and Zoe to have to sit in the presence of living, breathing children. Miles would lock himself in the bathroom, take shuddering breaths, his face squeezing with guilt and shame, the words he was too cowardly to say to Simon bubbling up at the bottom of his throat like a churning volcano. You and Mandy have your kids. They're both happy. They're both fine. Kit. My baby. My baby, Sai, he's gone. I can't. I won't ever see him again. One of those identikit evenings. Miles was sat by himself in the lounge, lost in thought. Zoe had gone to help Simon and Amanda clear away the plates. Anything that distracted her was a good thing. Martin lay on the carpeted floor in front of him, playing with his race cars. Miles watched him glumly. He didn't feel angry when he saw him anymore, just an ache of sadness that throbbed in his chest. Martin was 12 years old. Kit would never be 12. As Miles sat staring into space, Martin suddenly stopped playing with his toys and looked up at him. Miles met Martin's soft blue eyes warily. Miles? He asked. Miles sighed heavily. Yes, buddy? He said, forcing a smile. Martin looked thoughtful for a moment. "Are you very sad about Kit?" Miles's stomach felt like it was being shredded. He closed his eyes, clenched his jaw, balled his hands into fists. His scars stung like they were being dunked in lemon juice. With supreme effort, he buried his emotions and looked back at Martin. "Yes," he said finally. "I'm very sad." Martin looked down sadly, rolling one of his cards between his fingers. "I'm very sad too," he said. "I miss Kit a lot. I love playing with him." Miles smiled weakly at Martin, grateful for his innocence, his honesty. "I miss him too," he said, running his hands through his hair wearily. "He was a great kid, wasn't he?" Martin nodded enthusiastically. "He was the best. I liked it when he helped me build my racetracks. He was really good at it." Miles let out a hollow laugh through his tears.
He was good at everything, wasn't he?
Martin nodded again. Then after a moment's silence he spoke up. "Miles, can I ask you something?" "Sure, buddy, what's up?" Martin fidgeted with his race cars, then looked up at Miles with an earnest expression. "Do you think Kit is in heaven now?" Miles's breath caught in his throat at the question. He blinked back the tears. I don't know, Marty. But wherever he is, I hope he's happy." Martin nodded thoughtfully, then went back to playing with his cars. Miles watched him for a moment, then leant his head back and closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. "I hope he's happy," he thought to himself. The warm weather still refused to break as December rolled around, and the heaps of dead leaves were starting to rot in the streets. The stench of decaying plant matter filled the air like a heat shimmer, and Miles could swear that the stink was starting to creep its way into Brogden Close. Zoe had noticed it too, and it even seemed to linger when they opened all the windows in the house. Miles reasoned to himself that it must be coming from the garden. Its maintenance had hardly been high on their list of priorities. They'd only just started to make feeble efforts to groom themselves again. There was one room, of course, where they hadn't opened the windows. The door to Kit's room, the room where he had died, remained resolutely shut, as it had done for the last 3 months. Neither Miles nor Zoe had any desire to look upon that scene of horror, upon the tangle of bedsheets and the discarded toys, stationary and fossilised forever in the spots where Kit had left them, never again to be picked up. Ashley had been gently pushing them in their continuing counselling sessions to go back into the room to confront the epicentre of the trauma, as she had so antiseptically put it. Zoe seemed more open to the notion than Miles did. He saw the room every night in his dreams. To see it again in person seemed to him like his nightmares come to life. The earthy smell wasn't much better in Oxford either, but at the very least the cleaners had cleared the streets of the festering piles, and Miles only had to crash through a few stray heaps as he made his way through the city centre. He passed by the white classical edifice of the Ashmolean, pausing for a moment to regard his workplace. Miles thought of his desk, of everything he had left there when he came home from work the night before Kit died. There was a half-finished article for the museum blog, he recalled, on the Apotheosis of Germanicus. It was still in note form, waiting to be typed up. He had ordered a selection of Byzantine coins from the 2 reigns of the Emperor Justinian Ritometos up from the museum collection for comparison and categorisation. He wondered if the box was still sat on the trolley at the end of his office waiting for him to collect it, the visage of the slit-nosed Caesar grimacing up from the dulled silver coin face. Miles was sure he had left a banana in his top drawer too. He grimaced at the state of decay it must now be in if he had. Perhaps someone had noticed the smell, cleared out the liquefying carcass of the fruit and tossed it away. Or was it, like the rest of the things on his desk, as frozen in time as the toys in his son's room, stopped forever like the clock on St. Thomas's? Today wasn't the day to find out. His return to work had still not been approved, and in any case, what Miles needed today wasn't at the Ashmolean. He turned and headed right down Magdalen Street, past the crumbling steeples of St. Mary's and St. Michael at the North Gate, past Carfax Tower, which stood marooned among the modern gift shops and fast food joints, until he reached the Museum of Oxford. It was local history that he needed today, not distant dead Constantinople. Miles slipped inside. The museum was certainly less grandiose than the Ashmolean was, No sleek modern rebuild and names of wealthy donors here to be found. This museum was little more than 2 or 3 rooms shunted into the side of Oxford's town hall. It was one of those museums with colouring books for children, racks of costumes for them to dress up in. Miles stared for a moment at the plastic knight's helmet laying discarded next to the overflowing dress-up box. A memory of Kit wearing that helmet, wielding a rubber sword and giggling uncontrollably as he menaced his father with it, seethed its way up to the surface of Miles's mind. His reverie was interrupted by the arrival of Kevin, the museum manager. "Dr. Prescott?" the younger man asked. Yes, that's me," Miles said with a start. He shoved his bandaged hands into his pockets, not wanting to draw attention to his injuries. Nice to meet you, Kevin." Kevin had the look of one of those Oxford students who had touched down at the university and had then been unable to take off, Miles thought. He had the wasted, receding look that Miles had always imagined Robert Burton to have, slaving his way over 5 editions of The Anatomy of Melancholy as he withered away in his apartments at Brasenose. But the man seemed pleasant enough, and Miles savoured for a moment the sensation of meeting someone that didn't immediately bow their heads in sympathy. Kevin didn't know him, and Miles didn't intend to let him for the time being. "Nice to meet you too," Kevin said with a smile. "What brings you down from the big house to here, if you don't mind me asking?" Miles couldn't help but give a limp smile. The teams at all the other museums at Oxford tended to call the Ashmolean the Big House, a nod to its intense gravitational pull of funding resources away from their own institutions. Miles had missed being among his folk. "Well," Miles began, trying his best to sound normal, I've been working on this project, categorising the old headstones at St. Thomas's. St. Thomas the Martyr? The one by the train station. It's for, paper I've been working on. Anyway, I was wondering if you, or the museum here, I was wondering if, maybe you had a register, or some kind of list of who's buried there. At St. Thomas's, see, there's this one headstone that's like cracked down the middle, and it's lost the name. And I really need to know who it belongs to for the paper. Miles realised that he had been gesturing with his bandaged hands as he rambled. He quickly shoved them back into his pockets and cleared his throat awkwardly. "You sound like an insane person," he castigated himself. Kevin's smile slackened slightly, and Miles could see his eyes imperceptibly look him over. To Miles's relief, Kevin's smile tightened and he clapped his hands together. "You're looking for burial rolls? Well, you've certainly come to the right place. Follow me." "Thanks," Miles said, trying to hide his sigh of relief as he hadn't disturbed the younger man. Kevin twirled around on the heels of his shoes and pushed through a door next to the dressing-up pegs. Miles followed him, casting one last glance at the plastic knight's helmet, laying still and empty on its side. The offices of the Museum of Oxford were a lot more cramped than Miles had grown accustomed to. He sat idly on the slightly moth-eaten spinning chair next to the small desk, casting his gaze to the shelves overflowing with cluttered ring binders and files. The place had obviously not received the funding from the council to fully computerise, which boggled the mind slightly when Miles considered that it was housed in the same building as that very same council. "Kit is dead. What are you doing here? Your son is dead. What's the point of all this?" Miles's mind continued to churn and crash like a cement mixer, the same sludge of horrid thoughts and despair continuing to stew in his head. Miles wrapped his arms around himself, waiting impatiently for Kevin to return with the documents he'd asked for. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, Miles felt compelled to discover the identity of whoever that cracked tombstone belonged to. Perhaps it was his itch to work again? Perhaps it was some more noble desire to restore the name of a boy who had been deeply grieved. Whatever it was, Miles couldn't help but feel that the black cloud that clung onto him wouldn't begin to shift until he had put all the pieces of this particular puzzle back together. Miles's reverie was ended when the door creaked open and Kevin backed into the cramped office, pulling a trolley with him loaded with leather-bound books of an impressive size, crammed full of yellowing, crinkled pages. "Sorry," Kevin began. "Been ages since anyone has asked to pull these out." With a heave, Kevin lifted one of the fatter volumes onto the small desk, where it landed with a thud that made Miles jump despite himself. Miles slid his glasses onto his nose and pulled the book open. In thin spidery letters, the front page bore the legend, "Burials in the parish of St. Thomas the Martyr, 1718 to 1734. Rector T. Scrope." It certainly fit the date of the grave, Miles thought to himself, and he began to flick through the fragile pages as quickly as he dared, wincing slightly at his stinging hands. Kevin couldn't help but notice Miles's pain as he hovered over his shoulder.
"Are you okay?"
he asked, oblivious to the loaded nature of that word. Miles grimaced, struggling to hold back the flood of emotions still coursing through him. "Oh, I'm fine, thanks," he managed to blurt out. "Fell over in the garden, cut myself." Kevin seemed satisfied with the answer, as he didn't press the subject. He really was worryingly incurious for a man who answered questions all day, Miles thought. His attention was brought back to the book as he finally reached the entries for the winter of 1723. The writing was nearly illegible to Miles. The tiny Latin and Greek inscriptions he was used to studying on his coins were clearer than this. However, the little he could read revealed to him that the register was depressingly incomplete. Half of the names had faded with age, or so cramped that he could barely decipher them. A few words here and there jumped out at him, a withering slew of banal fatalities. "Advanced years," read one entry. "Rising of the lights," whatever that meant, was another. There was a depressing number of infants on the list, their cause of death listed simply as mortality, which was as general as it came. Miles had almost given up when he spotted it. At the very bottom of the page, crammed in tiny writing as if the rector's scrope had overestimated the amount of space he had to write in, was an entry for the 18th. "There you are," Miles whispered to himself. He felt a chill run down his back almost involuntarily.
"Found what you were looking for?"
Kevin asked, his head bobbing over Miles's shoulder. Miles barely looked up. "I think so," he replied hoarsely. "The date matches." Miles squinted at the entry, teasing out the words from the scroll. He muttered to himself as he read, barely noticing Kevin behind him. 18th day of December, Miles read, his voice hardly a whisper. Master something or other Harcourt, aged 10 years. Only son of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Harcourt, Esquire of Brogden Hall. He died by... Miles trailed off, the storm of his mind turning still for the first time in an age. The untidy word sat motionless in front of him, like a black insect squatting on the page. He gulped, his hands clenching, barely registering the flash of pain that coursed up his arms.
"Can you read it?"
Kevin asked. Miles was silent for a moment, his mouth chewing air as he struggled to articulate the words that had struck at his heart like a knife. He died, Miles at last read, by a twisting of his bed-sheets. He was back in the room, back in his nightmare. He was opening the curtains, calling out blithely to his son to get up for school. He was being met by silence, and he was turning around to see Kit in his bed, utterly, completely still. His blanket twisted around him. That was what had first struck him, that something was not at all right with the scene. It was not the stillness of his son. It was the blanket. It was curled, tangled, wrapped around Kit's legs and his arms like a python. It wasn't at all how Kit slept, and definitely wasn't how Miles had tucked him in the night before. The rest of the horrid, wretched memory played out on fast forward in Miles's head. The shaking, the screaming, the roaring with an agony that still throbbed 3 months later. He died by a twisting of his bed-sheets. The room was quiet for a moment. Kevin at last seemed to realise how disturbed Miles had been by what he had just read. He cleared his throat awkwardly.
Well, I've not heard that one before,
he said, trying to sound casual. Miles didn't say anything as he slowly closed the book, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. He felt sick. The room was spinning like the churchyard had been when he had cut his hands. I have, Miles whispered. Once. He handed the book gingerly back to Kevin.
And it was just the one record?
Kevin asked. Miles nodded.
It was a shame the name was faded out,
Kevin said to himself as he replaced the book back onto the trolley.
Still, I think you might have enough pieces to do some more digging.
Miles looked up at Kevin. I do? He said, blinking in confusion. Kevin looked at Miles curiously.
Well, in the entry you read, he explained, it said whoever that tombstone belonged to lived at Brogden Hall, and I've heard of that. It's one of the old manor houses here in Oxford.
Miles registered for the first time the other word. Brogden. His stomach clenched even tighter than it had before. It couldn't be. God could not be this cruel, this monstrous. Brogden Hall? Miles asked in a quiet voice. I don't know that one. Kevin rubbed the back of his neck.
I'd be surprised if you did. It's quite obscure, very much local history than anything they'd put much store in at the big house.
Miles jerked to his feet, trying and failing to appear normal. Where is it? He asked, although the fear pooling in his stomach told him that he already knew the answer. Kevin looked apologetic as he opened the door out of the office for Miles.
It's gone now, I'm afraid, Doctor, long gone. One of the manors torn down after the war to make way for housing. Semi-detached places. But you can go to where it was. They named a street after it, I think, on the site. Brogden Close, I think it is.
Miles and Zoe lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. They were both awake, like they were most nights now. Miles gripped the bedsheets in his hands. Pain shot through his arms, reaching almost to his heart now. His breathing was shallow, uneven. The room seemed violently dark and heavy. Miles could feel his mind boiling with panic and mounting dread, the inexplicable conclusions from the burial rolls tearing through his mind like talons. The boy in the grave, the beloved son, had been the same age as Kit. It seemed he had met his end in much the same way, and it was with a pulse of horror that Miles now knew that he had died close to the very spot that Kit had. Perhaps it was the exact spot, for who now knew where Brogden Hall had been in relation to where his and Zoe and Kit's house now stood? What space had once been taken up by that room, where Mr. Robert Harcourt had found his boy, his only child, dead and cold and ensnared in his sheets, like Miles had done 300 years later? How far had the scream travelled? Had Robert and his nameless wife walked the same miserable march from Brogden to St. Thomas, past the spot where Kit would lie, as Miles had passed their nameless son? Neither Miles nor Zoe broke the silence for a long time. Finally, Zoe turned to Miles. She hesitated for a moment, chewing her lip, feeling the tense, quivering arm of her husband in her hand, before speaking in a soft, faint voice. Do you remember when we took him to the beach? For the first time? Zoe's words seemed to waft into the hurricane of thoughts in Miles's head. He nodded, his eyes glistening. Yeah, I remember. He was so little. He loved the sand so much. I remember how he kept trying to eat it, Zoe whispered in a half chuckle despite herself. Miles smiled through his tears. And do you remember how he would laugh every time we buried him up to his neck in the sand? The memories were flooding back, and it seemed for a moment to wash away all the thoughts of Brogden Hall, of the cracked headstone. He loved that, and he always wanted us to take a picture of him like that. They both fell silent again, lost in their memories. After a few moments, Miles spoke again. You know what I miss the most? I miss his smile. He had the biggest, brightest smile I've ever seen. Zoe nodded in agreement. And I miss the way he'd laugh. He had the most infectious laugh, didn't he? Miles smiled sadly. Yeah, he did. I wish we could hear it one more time. They lay in silence for a while longer. Eventually Miles reached out and took Zoe's hand. We'll always have those memories, won't we? Zoe squeezed his hand back, tears rolling down her cheeks. He didn't mind the pain this time. Yes, we will. And we'll always have each other. The two were still holding hands as they drifted asleep. Miles was sure he was dreaming. He must be. For why else would he be standing outside the door to Kit's room? He hadn't come near it in months, hadn't even approached it, but now, without knowing how he'd got there, his hand was hovering just a few inches from the doorknob. His head swam as he tried to get his bearings. There were the words on his son's door. K-I-T. The wooden letters he had glued on, that Kit had filled in with the scribbles of his felt-tip pens. The door seemed so much more detailed than it had ever been in his dreams. The hallway seemed dark now, as if it were night, not the morning like it had been in the memory. Miles could see his hand lift slowly, as if underwater, as it reached for the doorknob. He tried to stop it, willing the bandaged hand to stop. "This isn't what you want to do," he pleaded with himself. But the relentless dream logic ensured that his commands went unheeded, and he soon felt the cold brass of the knob in his hand, so real and solid as he turned it. With an audible click, the door slowly swung inwards into the blackness of the bedroom. Please no." Miles could feel the tears on his cheeks as his legs carried him into the void, unable to stop himself as he trudged forward, pulled by whatever invisible force compelled him to move. Miles's eyes adjusted to the moonlight, spilling in from the half-open curtains of Kit's window. In the pale glow he could vaguely discern the dim shapes of the room, enough to recognise that it was entirely untouched, exactly as it had been that horrifying morning. There were Kit's toy cars, abandoned pell-mell across the carpet. There was his new backpack, never used, never to be used, hanging on the back of his chair. And there, in the far right corner of the room, next to the doorway, was the bed where Kit had died. There were the twisted, tangled bed sheets, heaped on the floor, where Miles had flung them when he tore them from Kit's body as he tried to wake him. The small indentation on the pillow where his head had lain was still there. Miles screwed up his eyes in misery, willing with all his might for the dream to end, to finally be rid of this waking nightmare. He wanted to open them and see Zoe's hair next to his head, to be back in his own bed. But when he did, he was still right where he had been standing. A tall, jagged shadow was now cast across the bed. Miles froze, all the hairs on his legs and arms rising at once. His breath caught in his throat. Slowly, agonizingly, he felt his head turn to his right. Between the window and the foot of the bed now stood the cracked tombstone. It blocked the streaming moonlight, forming a long, thin gash of black on the bed, a void where Miles knew Kit had lain. The face of the tombstone was lost in the shadows, the incomplete words vanished. Miles wanted to die. This was torture beyond endurance. His mind had conjured a horror he could hardly fathom that left his brain boiling and his stomach churning, and it would not return him to the waking world. "No," he mouthed, the words failing to be heard. No. It happened so fast, and yet felt like it went on forever. All at once, Miles felt a cold, soft touch on his foot. He had barely registered that his legs were now twisted in the discarded sheets when the ground gave way and he toppled forward. Gravity seemed to turn off as he fell towards the deathbed. The shadow of the tombstone swallowed him up as he crashed into the mattress, his nostrils filled with the fading, evaporating smell of his son, his Kit, and then he was wrenched off the bed with an inhuman pull. He slumped onto the carpeted floor with a cry, his whole body now twisted in the bedsheets, and the more he writhed and struggled, the more entangled he seemed to become. The sheets were around his neck now, tightening as he clawed frantically to pull them off. His hands screamed in pain as his scars tore open, the pain shooting towards his heart, which beat faster and faster with every ragged breath Miles took as he fought with the sheets, his eyes darting around the room. His nostrils clenched as a new smell replaced that of his son, The stench of rotting leaves was back, more intense, more repulsive than Miles had ever yet experienced. The air was so musty with mould that the few breaths he could take felt like they shortened each time. Miles's eyes rolled in his head towards the space under Kit's bed, and for the briefest of moments a face stared back out of the blackness. It was a face more hideous than Miles could possibly comprehend, a great mass of decaying, brown, organic matter, its slit nose and empty, gaping sockets staring skull-like as its toothless, shapeless mouth disgorged a wave of fetid, decayed breath. Miles screamed. His face twisted with a primal terror as his mind collapsed like spun sugar. The room span and the horrendous, gawping face of the monster vanished back into the shadows beneath Kit's bed. Miles screamed and screamed, all his fear and need and grief and discontent and anguish and vexation and lumpishness exploding out of him in a roar that felt like it was about to crack him in half. He was still screaming when he heard Zoe's own yells mixing with his own, felt her hands pulling away the sheets from around his neck. "Miles!" Zoe sobbed, her terrified, tear-stricken face materialising inches from his own. "Miles!" Miles couldn't breathe, the screams ripping through his lungs. Zoe was shaking his shoulders, pleading with him. "I can't lose you too!" Zoe retched, tears and snot dripping out her face in terror. "Don't leave me, Miles!" She tore away the last of the bedsheets and pulled Miles into an embrace, bawling into his shoulder. Miles's screams died away into uncontrollable sobs, wailing with fear as he returned the hug, the two clinging onto each other and rocking back and forth in the middle of Kit's bedroom. It took a long time for Miles to realise that his hands, his arms, and the sheets tossed around him were soaked in blood. His blood, his wounds open and weeping. The blood soaked him and Zoe as they clung onto each other, heaving with sobs. "Zoe!" Miles sobbed. "It's gone, Zoe!" The two of them sat crying into each other's arms until the sun rose, and Kit's room was filled with bright orange globules of light. The cold weather finally arrived just before Christmas, and by January it had well and truly blasted away the languid warm autumn that had preceded it. Frost crunched underfoot as Miles ascended the stone steps of the Ashmolean. He paused briefly beneath the tall columns of the entrance and gave a resolute sigh as he stepped back into his place of work for the first time in 4 months. Everyone was lovely to him, of course, all delighted that he was back and full of care and pledges that he could take as long as he needed to ease back into work, and that if there was anything they could do for him, or if he needed to talk or take a few moments, that they were there to help. Miles thanked them for their kindness, and it felt like progress that he no longer felt any bitterness at their sympathy. Miles made his way up to the Department of Antiquities in the glass elevator and was greeted at the door by Simon, who gave him a warm hug. "Miles," he said into his shoulder, "it's good to see you, man." Miles gave Simon a small smile. "It's good to see you too, Si." Simon wrapped a protective arm around Miles and walked slowly with him back through the office, past the familiar filing cabinets and rows of computers. "How are you feeling?" Simon inquired, fixing Miles with a look of utmost care. "Are you still sleeping better?" Miles nodded slowly. "I am, thanks," he said. "Now that I'm actually taking the prescription Ashley gave us. I'm getting 7 or 8 hours a night now." Simon grinned. "I'm glad to hear it. You deserve some rest. How's Zoe?" "Getting better?" Miles sighed, reaching his old desk. "She's been back at school since the new term started. She's taking it slowly, but she's got Mandy there and the others helping her, and she finally feels like she's getting back into the swing of things." Simon nodded. "I'm glad to hear that," placing his hand on Miles' shoulder. He paused for a moment. "How are you really doing, Miles?" he asked. Miles sighed and set down his bag. There was a lingering weariness about his eyes. "It's been tough, Si. It still is. Losing Kit the last few months. It's the hardest thing we've ever gone through. But Zoe and I, we're slowly finding our way back to some sense of normalcy. It's just hard sometimes." Simon nodded in understanding. "I know, Miles, but you've got a lot of people who love you and are here for you. Don't ever forget that." Miles took Simon by his hand and squeezed it. "I won't, Si. And I'm grateful for all of you, really, for you and Mandy especially. You were there for us after my panic attack in December. You've been there for me and Zoe when we needed it most." Simon shook Miles's hand. "That's what friends are for, buddy." Miles smiled, his first genuine smile in what felt like an age. He turned to his desk, taking in the notes for his article on the Apotheosis of Germanicus. The boxes containing the coins of Justinian Rhinometos sat waiting to be opened, all as he was expecting. Apart from one item. A thin, beige folder, which had definitely not been there when he had last seen his desk, was lying on top of all the other papers. "What's this?" Miles asked with a half grin. "You guys lumping me with more work so soon?" Simon was already walking away and turned back to face him. Oh no, wouldn't dream of it. You just finished what you started, and at your own pace, Miles. I think that came in for you yesterday, from the Museum of Oxford, I think. Guy called Kevin dropped by, said he'd found some more information for you on that paper you were working on." Miles watched as Simon turned the corner and left, his smile fading. He turned back to the folder. Sure enough, a handwritten note from Kevin was paperclipped to the front. He lowered himself into his chair and slid on his glasses, picking up the folder to read it. His nostrils clenched at the rotten, fetid smell coming from his top drawer, where he had left the banana.
"To Miles," the note read. "Found this in the archives earlier this week. Looks like an old rector at St. Thomas's photographed your headstone back before the top bit got lost. Hope it's useful. All best, Kevin."
All the sound in the office seemed to fall away in a moment. Miles went ashen, his stomach twisting in dread, as the vision of the cracked tombstone loomed before him once more. Gingerly, he opened the beige folder. A single print was inside. There, in the faded sepia image, was the headstone, uncracked, towering over the grass at its full height, its inscription cast in deep, shadowed letters. "In fond and loving remembrance of Master Christopher Francis Harcourt, the only son of Robert Harcourt, Esquire, of Brogden Hall, and his wife Mary. His young heart was stopped when he met a dreadful and sudden end in the 10th year of his age, on the 18th day of December, 1723, to the misery of his mother and father. Beloved son, asleep." From the carved decorations at the top of the headstone, the slit-nosed face from under the bed looked back at Miles with a grin. Beloved Son, Asleep was written and performed by Isaac Hart. The music was by Kevin MacLeod. The script editor was Jennifer Rhiann Bartley. Ghost in the Museum will return with a new original story on the 27th of November. Thank you for listening. May we meet again.